Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to the committee. Thank you so much for having these hearings. This morning, I would like to speak about my House Bill 175. It is a bill that will require training of police officers, including Pennsylvania State Police and county sheriffs, in the area of lethality assessment and domestic violence cases. Domestic violence, whether it be verbal, emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, it's truly one of the most despicable crimes. Someone who claims to love a person should not act in a manner that causes irreparable harm and danger, not only to that relationship, but to the victim. Domestic violence is a widespread problem and impacts all walks of life, and the numbers don't lie. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men are victims of physical violence by an intimate partner here in the United States. 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year, and between 2006 and 2015, 1,496 Pennsylvanians died as a result of domestic violence. 2 of those victims lost their lives in 2015 are the driving force behind my bill. In May 2015, Lori Kukendall and her friend Barbara Schrum were murdered by Lori's estranged husband in a domestic violence incident when the women attempted to go back to Lori's former home in Warrington Township in York County to retrieve some belongings. 1 death as a result of domestic violence is too many, and that is why we must equip our police officers with the tools and the training to properly implement a lethality assessment program here in Pennsylvania. The lethality assessment program is an extremely effective method for law enforcement officers to identify victims of domestic violence who are at the highest risk of being seriously injured or killed by their intimate partner. LAP, as it's known, has been proven to work in Maryland, where it originated. Our southern neighbors have seen a 25% drop in domestic violence-related homicides thanks to training their police officers in this lethality assessment protocol. My local police departments in York County, we're right on the border with Maryland, are using LAP with much success on a daily basis. Chief Jeffrey Bean of Southwestern Regional Police in York County has stated that, quote, if a method shows just 1% in decline in deaths, we would immediately sign up for that. So 25% is just simply a godsend. With domestic violence incidents being one of the most common and the most deadly calls that a police officer receives, I'm sure Representative Costa can attest to that from his time on the Pittsburgh Police Force, the LAP would certainly help to save police officer lives, as well as the lives of those domestic violence victims. So once victims are screened into those services, there is that decreased risk of those repeated domestic violence calls. Dr. Jacqueline Campbell of the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing has studied domestic violence incidents for decades in Maryland. She's concluded that only 4% of domestic violence murder victims nationwide avail themselves to domestic violence program services. And in 50% of domestic violence-related homicides, officers had previously responded to a call there. And finally, she found that reassault of domestic violence victims in high danger was reduced by 60% if they were screened into services and went to a shelter. These numbers certainly show that there is a need for lethality assessments in domestic violence cases. The LAP has a proven track record of being an extremely effective method for police officers to identify those victims and screen them into services. Through a series of 11 questions, an officer can determine if there is an increased risk for a homicide. If there is an elevated risk, the officer calls a 24-hour domestic violence hotline and seeks advice and encourages the victim to speak with that specially trained advocate. Now, the victim is not required in any way to take that call or to seek out services, but that is at least offered to them as an option. Now, there are 11 questions with the lethality assessment protocol. The first 3 questions are really at the heart of the questionnaire. The first question, has he or she ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Has he or she threatened to kill you or your children? And third, do you think he or she might try to kill you? Now, if the individual answers yes to any of those three questions, that individual is automatically told there is an increased risk for your life and your safety of you and your children. And the police officer says, we highly recommend you speak to domestic violence services so you can get the help and safety that you need for you and your children. Now, the remaining questions go on, does he or she have a gun, or can he or she easily get one? Has he or she ever tried to choke you? Is he or she violently or constantly jealous? Or does he or she control most of your daily activities? Have you left him or her or separated after living together or being married? Is he or she unemployed? Has he or she ever tried to kill him or herself? Do you have a child that he or she knows is not his or hers? And does he or she follow or spy on you or leave threatening messages? Now, if the individual answers yes to 4 of those questions, then that would trigger a discussion about a call to domestic violence services. Now, once that referral is made, the local domestic violence shelter takes that victim, wraps them in their arms, and takes them from there. And that victim is immediately screened into a number of different services. It can be anything from a night into a shelter to finding another place to stay with family or starting the process for a PFA. In my community, our local police officers perform this lethality assessment during domestic calls on a daily basis, and they refer those victims to our Hanover area YWCA Safe Home, and this program has much success. Another aspect of this bill is to ensure that our police officers have the proper tools and training to aid victims of domestic violence, and I understand that this preparation comes with a cost. To help community police services receive the financial assistance needed for this training and the equipment, including cell phones. That's one thing that I've heard is cell phones are the #1 equipment needed in responding to these calls. This legislation would create the police department grant program, and this program would allow police departments to apply for grant funding to cover costs associated with training and other equipment used to respond to domestic violence incidents, and this would be through gaming funds. There is already a mechanism for this. It would just be expanding what police departments could apply for grants. Now, helping victims receive the care they need is truly the main aim of my legislation. I want to make sure that we're protecting police officers who respond to those dangerous calls by equipping them with the training that they need to best assist those victims. And ultimately, we're making sure those victims remain safe and sound. Since Laurie and Barbara's tragic and needless deaths, their families have been very strong and vocal advocates for victims and especially for the implementation of this lethality assessment program throughout Pennsylvania. Barbara's daughter, Alicia, she actually has a number of friends who live in Maryland. She lives in Maryland now, and that is where she came up with the idea of doing this in Pennsylvania, because many of her friends who are police officers in Maryland are doing this on a daily basis and seeing the results at a 25% reduction in the number of deaths by homicide for domestic violence victims. And as such, this bill is going to be known as Laurie and Barbara's Law, in honor of Laurie Kuykendall and Barbara Schrum. I thank those family members, Karen Nortzik and Alicia Armhold, for really truly being the advocates and turning a very bad situation in their family into a positive for other victims, so that other victims and families do not have to go through what they went through. The bravery and perseverance of these victims and their families should give us all hope and an incentive to fight for them and stand up and say no more. Now, with the passage of House Bill 175 and the training of our police officers in lethality assessment, we will do just that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your work on this. How many co-sponsors do you have on the bill?
Let me check right now.
About?
It's probably close to 15 or 20 right now.
Okay. And then, so does law enforcement support your bill? Have they come out in favor?
So my locals have come out and supported this bill, and I know that they've been talking across the state as I've talked to various police officers, they want this bill. My own father-in-law is a retired police officer from Springettsbury Township. He's actually a local MDJ in York County, so he has seen both sides of this issue, and he truly believes that all officers should be trained in properly responding to domestic violence cases. And I know Representative Dom Costa, former chief of Pittsburgh, is a sponsor of this bill. So there's certainly law enforcement.
That's always good to have his sponsorship, his support. So what about have you heard anything negative or any non-supporters of this concept?
At this point, no. Across the state, all of our domestic violence service groups are working with local police departments in making sure that our domestic violence victims are getting the services that they need, and are working hand in hand with our local police officers in making sure that happens.